Welcome to Chapter 15, our second of the definitely 4 chapters we'll have on Exam 4. Another conceptual theoretical type chapter, so I recommend you print out the outline or use the outline. It will save you some writing or typing or however it is that you are taking notes, because I already took the time to type in a lot of the definitions and lists. So only one of us has to do it, not 30 of us. Anyways. All right, so this chapter, like I already mentioned, will be another conceptual chapter, so just all multiple choice. Not as many theories and not as hardcore theoretical as capital structure, but this chapter is all about distributions to shareholders, which basically means 2 things. It means stock dividends, cash dividends, I should say, not because there are stock dividends, right? And there are cash dividends. So when I say stock dividends there, I mean dividends coming from common stock. But in this chapter, we're not going to actually even probably have time to talk about stock dividends. So you can always just assume that when we say dividends, we mean a cash dividend, a cash distribution to our shareholders. But there's actually a second way we can provide a cash distribution to our shareholders, and that is with repurchases. And we see companies use both. We also see companies pay out no dividends. And so this is another area of finance where we're like, oh, some companies pay dividends, some companies don't. Why? Why is one company making choice A and the other company is making the opposite choice B? Because if one of them was the absolute right choice to maximize firm value, well, then every company would be pursuing that choice, right? And so this is another area where there is no absolute right answer as to, when should a firm start issuing dividends? How much should they issue in dividends? When and how should they increase their dividends? What happens if they cut their dividends? Do we do repurchases instead of dividends? There's no absolute answer to any of these questions. So we just have these theories about things that are going to impact a firm's decision to distribute money to shareholders, either through a stock or a cash dividend or a stock repurchase. And also, what do investors want? Not just what does the firm want to do, not just what can the firm, actually do, but what do shareholders want the firm to do, right? Because that's going to ultimately determine the attractiveness of a firm's stock, is if they're, paying out dividends or not paying out dividends, if they're doing repurchases, all these sorts of things. So this plays into our concept of valuation, because we know that we had these free cash flows, right, which ultimately flows into that valuation model where we discount free cash flows by WACC. Well, when I have those free cash flows, what's one of the things I can do? I can pay dividends. What's another thing I can do? I can do a stock repurchase. And so how do I determine if I want to use my free cash flows to pay a stock dividend? Again, I'm going to keep saying stock dividend. I don't mean stock dividend as a dividend of stocks. I mean a dividend from a stock as a cash dividend. Sorry, bad habit. But, do I want to use my free cash flows to pay out a cash dividend or to do a stock repurchase? And so just to start us off as a little reminder, where do these free cash flows come from in the first place? Well, it comes from typically the operations of a firm, we hope, right? It could come from the sale of an asset, right? That could generate me some free cash flows for the company, but I can't just keep selling all my assets, because eventually I will have no assets. I will have no company then, right? But those cash flows are generated from the firm pursuing profitable NPV projects and, turning these projects into actual profits, right? Like actually executing them in a way that earns the firm these free cash flows. Now, once we have them, how do we use them? Again, there's 5 basic ways, but we can kind of group them slightly different, because we have to realize that if the free cash flows end up being negative, that implies one thing that I do with them. If they end up being positive, that implies another. So when I look at debt, I can choose with my free cash flows as to pay interest, repay debt, or issue new debt. Well, I pay interest or repay debt whenever I have positive free cash flows. But if I have negative free cash flows, I may need to go out and actually issue debt, right? Because I need to cover those negative free cash flows with something. And one of the ways I can do that is I can issue debt for the firm. Now, we've already talked about this. Just because a firm has negative free cash flows, that doesn't mean it's a bad firm. It doesn't even mean it's a not profitable firm. A firm may be profitable, but be generating negative free cash flows. Why? Because they're growing. And growth takes money, right? You need to make an investment today to have higher sales in the future. And then eventually those, sales will turn into profits, which will turn into free cash flows in the future. And so don't, look at firms with negative free cash flows automatically as bad. It just means we are generating negative free cash flows, right? Like I said, it could be because we're growing a lot and having to make a lot of investments in capital assets. All right. Another thing we could do with our free cash flows, we can says purchase or sell these short-term investments over here. So this first one took care of these the left 2 boxes. The second one here takes care of this right box. Now I would purchase short-term investments when I have positive free cash flows. I would sell short-term investments whenever I needed to cover the gap, right? Because I would sell those short-term investments and that would generate some cash to cover a negative free cash flow, okay? The last one here, kind of category I can do is this middle 2. It says I can pay dividends or repurchase stock. Well, I can do that when I have positive free cash flows. When I have negative free cash flows, that's when I would go ahead and issue new shares of stock, right? Because once again, I have to cover that gap of having those negative free cash flows. So make sure you realize that, my actions that I pursue, they fall into each one of these 5 categories, but it could be flipped around depending on if free cash flows are negative or positive. Now, here's the thing. This first group up here, that's determined by a firm's capital structure policy, right? Which is what we talked about in chapter 16. How much debt we choose to use, when we choose to pay it off, when we choose to issue it, all of that is determined by capital structure. The second one here is going to be determined by a firm's working capital policy. Your book uses WC to abbreviate working capital. For some reason, I learned it WK. Yes, I know capital is not spelled with a K. So if you see me write WK instead of WC, I apologize. Habit again. Our last one down there. Oh, and we'll talk about working capital policy in the next 2 chapters, our last 2 chapters, basically. So heads up on that. This last one is determined by a firm's distribution policy, largely. Also by its capital structure, right? If I decide to issue stock, or if I decide to, let's just say if I decide to issue stock. But this concept of paying dividends or repurchasing stock, that is directly determined by a firm's distribution policy. What do we mean when we say distribution policy? The level of distributions, the form of those distributions, whether they're going to be dividends or if they're going to be repurchases, is the main kind of vice versa we'll look at in the chapter, basically, between those 2 choices. And then finally, the stability. So how much should we pay out as a distribution? What form do investors prefer that distribution to come as or come in? I don't know. English is hard sometimes. And then how much do investors perceive or how much do investors, let's say, value, it's a better word, stability in distributions? Does that matter to them? And so these are kind of issues to keep in mind throughout the rest of the chapter. And so first we'll look at some practical matters regarding these distributions. And again, basically our two choices and what do we actually see firms do. We'll look at some different theories, of course. And then we'll look at one basic model. And then we'll do some comparison again of, when does a firm, or why does a firm do a repurchase versus a dividend, or a dividend versus a repurchase, or are there some situations in one distribution method is better than the other? So those are the kind of issues we'll look at in this chapter. We won't cover stock dividends, actual stock dividends, not cash dividends. We won't cover stock dividends or stock splits in this chapter just because we're not going to have time. And you should have heard about that already at some point in your life. So that is kind of where we're going. Hopefully we can get through it a little bit quicker than chapter 16, which was long. So yeah, we're getting there though. This should be a little bit more straightforward than chapter 16, I think.